Chapter 24. The documents proving the legal ownership of Bibbenberg usually resided in the monastery beside her estate in Glaswester. Why Ethelfled, Lady of the Mersons, had chosen to retrieve them that night, she was not entirely sure. But the strength of her brother was increasing, having now secured the lands Guthrum, Aethelstan, once owned in East Anglia, and was working his way north, and she knew that, one day, together, they would be pressing north. And it was the owner of this land who would be the key to the north. He would both influence Eothwick and the Scots. The owner of Bibbenberg mattered. There was no mention of a cousin, also called Eutod. Ælfric's son had left Northumbria with no word since. It was vital, Ethelfled knew, that the name of the person claiming the land was called Eutod. Eutod, son of Eutod. Her Eutod had once been called Osbert. His son, whom he had rejected, had been named Eutod. Now, he called him Judas, the name of Eutod being passed to Eutod's younger son. The cousin Eutod, Ethelfled considered, could easily be dealt with. Silver here, land there to those who heard of his whereabouts, which led to his capture and death. For, what would Ælfric have to fight for then when he had no legacy? In the glimmering candlelight, Ethelfled caressed the script inked by the Lindisfarne monks so many years ago. She loved Eutod of Bibbenberg before she had even met him, loved the idea of a brave man, disinherited, come to find men to get back his land. Ethelfled had been 6 when she had seen him, the tall, long-haired Dane as he was thought to be, swathed in fur. She loved him then, even though she hard hid from him behind her father's throne as he strode into Winchester's hall as if he owned it. What would she not do for him now, as he fought for her? The idea of reclaiming his homeland smouldering in his heart. Their armies would get there in time, hers and Edward's, and Eutod would have all their men, should he need them, to take back what was his. As Ethelred made to roll up the parchment and wrap the leather lace around it, her eye was drawn to something which she was sure she had never seen before. Pulling the document flat, and sweeping her hair defiantly out of the way, she scanned across with her eye. There, in a hand different to that of the original scribe, in a hand which had cramped the letters to one side next to Eutod, son of Eutod, were more. A name. Daughter of Eutod. Ethelfled, her arms shaking as she sought more light, thrust the paper near a large sheep tallow one, whose light glowed brighter. Edra, daughter of Eutod and Jaitha of Cumbraland, of Urien's line. Ethelfled read it again, and once more, before looking for any more mention of Edra. But there were none. Edra, Ethelfled mused, as she took the document with her, rather than returning it to the monastery, instead, thrusting it into her saddle-bag. So, Eutod had a sister. Did she know her? Had they met? Because had been the last person to possess these documents. Edra, Eutrod's daughter, Ethelfled mused. Who are you? 88,888,888. Osrith was strangely sad to leave Gert's fishing boat on the afternoon of All Saints' Day. Sainid had taken the sleeping Edra, and suggested Osrith should sleep. When she had awoken, the rain petered out, and a brighter day had dawned. She watched Constantine's warrior as she opened her eyes and realized at once that they would look, to someone observing them, like a family, husband, wife and child together. It would probably afford her more protection than traveling alone, and once again, Osrith felt the familiar rush of softness towards the man, who had only ever treated her with kindness and respect. "Are you afraid?" Sainid asked, when they had fed Edra and found a room in a monastery at Rumsey, on the road towards Winchester. He took up Osrith's hand, a strangely gentle gesture, waiting patiently for her to answer. Osrith looked down to his hands, as she had answered, yes. She had seen those hands finish 3 men in as many seconds, equal only to Alfred's household guard, steeper. If she decided to stay in Wessex, if Becker, on meeting his daughter, decided he wanted his daughter raised by the nuns, for example, would Sainid use those hands, those fingers to choke the life from her, as she knew he had been instructed to? Would he use them to press a cloth to her face to stifle her, clench them around steel and thrust downwards into her neck or her stomach, watching her blood ebb from her form? Or would Sainid do none of these things, if Osrith chose not to return to Dunnottar, instead, allowing her to remain, allowing her, encouraging her, to go, as he had once done before? But then, could she do that to the girl? Dunnottar was all she knew. Constantine was her father and Osrith her mother. She must return her to Alba, no matter Boker's wish. She slept curled up beside Edra that night, and on the bed opposite, Sainid sat, whispering to himself in Gaelish, as he always did before a battle. For a man who had never left Alba, Wessex must have been a strange place indeed. But the land had changed too. Somehow, the people seemed more settled, they had more self-assured. Already there had been talk, on the coach to Rumsey, and now, on the coach to Winchester, not of fear of the Danes, but of trade between burghs, and not just Wessex burghs, but those beyond the Thames to the east, and Afan to the west, the ancient natural border between Wessex and Mercia. Some of those towns beyond even the Danelaw border. As the miles slipped away under the wheels of the cart, so Osrith's apprehension grew. When they got to the southern gate of the city, the chalk hills rising behind it, she wanted nothing more than to run all the way back to Hampton and give the rest of her silver to anyone who would take them to Alba. Why had she come back? It was a hateful place. She just wanted to take up Buey and hack at the stones, as if it were the infrastructure itself that was to blame. And, if she found Uther there, Osrith knew she would wish to take up Domhnall's blade to him, too. But, then, she wouldn't, for Finan, loyal, oath-bonded Finan, Uther's oldest friend, would stand between them. She could never fight Finan and mean it, and he knew it. That's if both of them were still alive. The monastery is beyond the palace walls, she told Sainid in Gaelish. He knew one or two words of English, the important ones, like ale and food, horse and water, but though he didn't show it, Winchester must have felt so alien to him. So, when Osrith looked into a face she knew, who barred their way at the gate, it was she had to do the talking. We seek there. Osrith broke off as she thought of the status of Boker now. Once Alfred's priest, he had been turned away from the palace by Elswith. Stipa looked between her and Sainid, then down at Edra, who was gripping Osrith's hand tightly. We seek a priest, by the name of Boker, Osrith said, the huge man's eyes searching for trouble. He is, or he was, at the palace. We have word he sickens. Who asks? Stipa's face was impassive. He made to reach for his sword as Osrith strode forward. It was ... most loyal of men, man. Slow to thought, quick to blade. Of everyone, he had judged her solely on her sword skill. She had had the job of guarding the Etheling Edward, and, to him, that was that. I do, Stipa, Osrith said, quietly, looking up at his wide, honest face. Osrith Lackland. It took a moment for this information to work round Stipa's mind, but, when it did, he broke out into a wide smile. Osrith, it is you, he declared, then frowned, because the thought process didn't tally. Where have you been? We've missed you at the Two Cranes. He lowered his voice and stooped closer to her, whispering near her cheek, not that you drink. But there are some fine girls ... boys ... at the Two Cranes in, He flung an arm round her shoulders, and added, as if accessing a memory, Osrith. When instead she flinched, rather than joining his reminiscences, Stipa took a step back, unused to Osrith not laughing with him about the alehouse. He looked past her and eyed Sainid, sensing she was no longer a comrade at arms. In turn, Sainid eyed Stipa back, touching his sword, so swift with the blade that he was. You didn't know he had it until he'd taken your arm off with it. Stipa then glanced down, at a silent, wide-eyed Edra, then back to Osrith, removing his arm, standing up straight. I've been doing the king's work, Stipa, Osrith said carefully, hoping Stipa wouldn't press which king. I seek Father Boker with this child. He is very ill, Stipa confirmed. He may already be dead. He was taken into the monastery. Then you can let us pass. Osrith hoped her words sounded like instruction, but instead they choked in her throat. May already be dead. Number. You cannot. Stipa folded his arms, blocking her way. SEHM of Steel told Osrith that Sainid had withdrawn his sword. Bishop Erkenwald has forbidden all visitors. Then, I would see the king. Osrith's words rang out. defiantly, "I be allowed to take this child to Father Bacchus But Steeper was no longer listening to Osrith. He had drawn out his blade and was holding it towards Sainid. Osrith took Edra's hand, hoping this would subdue a scream, for the child looked very frightened. "No!" shouted Osrith as the two warriors stood offensively. "Steeper!" Osrith turned to Sainid, Chartoilumcio, and repeated, "To Steeper, I do not like this." Sainid glanced down to Osrith, and smiled the confident smile of the experienced, wily fighter that he was, and moved. Osrith pulled Edra back, horrified. The head of the king's household guard lunged, but his target was no longer there. Indeed, Sainid was now behind Steeper, who had vouched for and defended Osrith more times than she could count. Edra screamed, and hid her head against Osrith's leg, clinging to her. Osrith put her arms around her, shouting for them to stop, her words lost in the din of clattering ironware. Osrith felt for beauty, but thought better of it. "Just get to Boca, then get home. I will take you." Around them, a small crowd was gathering, and out of it, in grey linen a figure stood. She looked bigger than her frame, and seemed to appear like a spirit amongst them. Osrith had no words, but the magic that Abbess Hild brought with her presence was enough to still both men's blades. "I will take you," Abbess Hild repeated, arms outstretched, between the two warriors. They fell back, Steeper to the gate, Sainid next to Osrith. Her tone was softer, and she looked at Osrith, intrigued, then held out a parchment. "Your king, of Alba, had the foresight to send a message to King Edward that you would be arriving," she added. Of course, thought Osrith. Of course he would write to Edward. Constantine, with Domnall, using the model of the UNA copyright Hill's kingdom in Ireland, had achieved what Ethelfled and Edward had yet to achieve, a united land. It would be just like Constantine to use her visit to remind Edward of this. They followed Hild, past Steeper, who was still mutually sizing up Sainid, up the high street and to the town's cross, where, in the mid-afternoon's light, many citizens were kneeling. Hild said little, but led them past Aldgate, skirting the eastern wall of Palace, a place Osrith knew well, having leapt over it many times. What was it that her shit of a brother was fond of saying? "We'd bid full Arad." Fate is inexorable. So fate had brought her back to Winchester. But it was not the same place she had left, and the bitter memories of the time when Alfred died, up to when she left, were diminishing as the sights she remembered were getting replaced in her visual memory with new ones. This was a new time, and her purpose at the capital city of Wessex was, though directly connected through Edra, far different. They had both left. He also liked to say that reputation was all. Osrith's reputation would hang under the cloud of her warriorship, of being Edward's whore, of the ghost of a rumour of witchcraft, which had, she reckoned, followed her right from Doyle, where Osrith herself had said begun it, trying all she had to defer Nine Fingers. The monastery was even more lavish than when Osrith remembered. 2 new sections had been added, and a third was under construction. She glanced at the rooms built off the kitchens as Sainid guarded their wake. This was the last place she had seen the abbess, the infirmary, when she was beyond despair, as Gisela, on her feet, screaming with pain at the difficulty of the birth, had called for Osrith to fetch help. Now, long shadows fixed the place in her mind. She knew what Hild meant, though the holy woman would not openly say it. Nothing the nuns had done could help the baby in breach, his little feet appearing at times, but would disappear and would not turn. Did Hild recognize Osrith now? Constantine had written, or at least, Mary might have, or a priest or monk on his behalf. Constantine resisted writing whenever he could, so Hild would know she was Osrith. She kept her hair short now, short since the day she had given up on Winchester. Her hair that Finan had so admired discarded on the lodging floor, Utah's silver sewn into her clothes. What she had not banked on was the scream from Boca and Thyra's home that afternoon, nor the fire, her rescue of Boca's wife and Thyra giving birth in Allah's house. And now she was here, with her theft. Edra. What would Boca say when he discovered the truth? Would he anger, or understand? At the threshold of the oak-framed hall doorway, the abbess paused, looking at Sainid. "No weapons," she said. Sainid who, of course. Did not understand, remained unmoved. You may not bring weapons into this house, Hild declared again. No warriors. No warriors? Osrith repeated tersely, having neglected to translate for Senid, and so he remained armed. She made a show of turning. Then I go, all the way back to Alba. She looked at Senid, and then down at Edra. We have had a wasted journey, Nyan a tilde lane, she half whispered. At the Gaelish words for lovely girl, Senid also looked at Edra, who had turned with Osrith. But then she stopped at Hild's protests. No, no. The abbess protested, raising her hands, in protest. Senid is with me, Senid stays by my side, or this child will not see her father. And please tell me that godforsaken Shitas Utad is not lurking around as he used to. Utad? Now, Hild looked puzzled, and she frowned at Osrith, of Bibbenberg. I also have, from the King of Alba, Osrith pushed on, a gift for the King of Wessex. Perhaps, as Constantine's warriors, she spat the word bitterly. Now you have decided we may not pass, we would please ask it if the abbess could afford as much majesty proportional to the value of the gift when you present it to Edward. Osrith was enjoying the conflicting emotions of outrage and shock that her blunt words had elicited on Hild's face for the barest of moments, before kindness irradiated from it, as it always did, and Osrith eased the wool blanket off her shoulder, which she had been carrying, bundled up with cord. Within, the book glowed in the late afternoon candlelight. Hild's face froze, her mouth dropped open as she looked at the leather cover, and extended a hand to turn it, and look at the pages. A Bible, she managed. Osrith took, marveled at the pages, illuminated in vivid colors, as had the Bible painted at Kells under the instruction of Malmuir. An Irish Bible, Hild said, turning more. An animal-formed decoration bordered each page, opening their mouths to breathe the word of God onto a page, or lift a paw to reveal further gospel scripture. It is. Hild looked between it and Osrith. Spectacular. Is toil lethal I, Osrith said to Senid. She likes it. Shanfam mi angelska bruin gus sin facen, na Ian. Senid replied, wryly. I don't have to know English to see that, girl. Thentiakrazom, Edra whispered, looking imploringly at Osrith. I'm hungry. You ate on the carriage. Look. Osrith dropped to Edra's height. The words in English are not solely intended for the girl. I have food for you. Edra brightened and looked expectant. I need you to visit someone here, then we will find a place for us to spend the night. You will have some in a minute. Osrith broke off for effect, still looking at Edra, then pulling out half of the bread she had in the bundle. Eat this now, and we will find you something in a short while. Yes, yes, Mama, Edra replied, as if the food depended on her compliance, then took it, chewing on it, hungrily, her gold-red hair reflecting in the hall's candlelight. Then, Osrith turned to Hild, proffering the wool blanket. Abbess Hild passed it to her, slowly, as if wishing it to remain in her fingers. Osrith rewrapped and shouldered it again. I have a child here, she needs to see her father. Abbess Hild, Osrith said, again enjoying Hild's bemusement at an apparent stranger knowing more than they should. Father Booker. To her credit, Hild remained unmoved, even if she was surprised. Father Booker is very unwell, she replied, holding Osrith's gaze a fraction longer. Considering Osrith, and the child's father's name, Booker. Booker is her father. Does she not look like him? Anger was getting to Osrith now, and her phrases were becoming sharp. Irritated. Or his wife, Osrith emphasized. Thyra? She gestured with her head to Senid to come, taking Edra by the girl's free hand and walking across the hall, past Hild, still armed. Beyond it, the sick were treated. Gisela had been treated, and now Osrith had worked up enough anger to overcome her aversion to stepping foot in that place again. Footsteps on the stone floor suggested the abbess was following her. Just one moment. Hild called. Osrith. Osrith ignored her and continued to step purposefully towards the infirmary. A moment. You mentioned Utad. Osrith stopped, and turned. Shitas Utad, Osrith clarified, eyeing Hild, daring her to protest. Thabrater touched Nagam, she added, for Sainid's benefit. He smirked. Utad of Bibbenberg. Hild tried. Do you know another? I do not. He is not with you? Osrith pressed, tersely, beside her. Sainid raised his head as he recognized the word Bibbenberg. For it is likely that I will kill him. Fairford, near the Thames, is his mercen estate, said Hild, brightly. Osrith felt the sigh leave her body. In utter relief. She imagined, for a second, his men with him, sitting with him, Finan close. She dashed Finan's face from her mind. Were he here, Utad would have demanded to know why she had a child with her that she claimed to be Bocca. If Osrith let him, for her festering rage was being pricked merely being in Wessex's capital. Forgive me, before you see Bocca, may I know your name? Hild could see she was defeated. You do not know me? I do not. The letter merely mentioned King Constantine's loyal servant. Osrith looked around the hall, a gesture conveying her belligerence, hiding her fear. This is impressive. Abbess Hild. Donations, I presume, now the Danes have ceased raiding? Wessex wealthier? By Hild's expression, Osrith was right. Not like I remember, this too much. She glanced around at the fittings, wall hangings of rich wool, the polished oak table and lintels, also of oak. You have done a great deal in 6 years. She continued by appraising the tapestry mat rugs by the altar, the candle holders, the higher quality habits of the nuns bustling through laying the long oak table in the hall with tin plates and cups. I do know you, Hild said, suddenly. She had got there, Osrith realized, and gave the abbess no opportunity to say. I fled, on the day of Alfred's funeral, Abbess Hild. I went home. Famille tilde Alba, she added, for Sainid's benefit. The day that, Osrith hesitated, but managed, Ethelwold sent a man to aggravate Thyra, to set their house alight. Hild's mouth fell open for a second time. That cannot be. Hild's composure returned and she carefully offered the presumed alternative, the accepted story. Thyra, God preserve her soul, perished in that fire. No. Osrith's voice was loud, and it echoed through the hall. No, she did not. She dropped Edra's hand and stalked stiffly towards Hild, her voice low, menacing. I followed. I fought the man. I took Thyra to the Heen, to Ul-A. She was delivered of a child. Osrith turned away, teeth clenched. It was as much as she could stand. Instead, she glared into the darkening annex. The late autumn night was falling. Silence hung around them as metal on oak clinked farther away. As Osrith made to take up Edra's hand, Hild bent her knees, crouching to look at the child, reaching up her hand to touch Edra's golden-red hair, then looked slowly up, belief written in her face. I will claim sanctuary, Osrith thought, if we are hindered. Then, I will fight, if I must. I will not remain here to hang as a pagan or a witch. Edra, who will know her father tonight, then will return with me to Constantine tomorrow. Sainid will. What would Sainid do? As her mind reformulated a plan, Hild rose and trod towards the infirmary. Come, bring the child. Bocca may see his daughter yet. They followed, but Hild stopped, suddenly, hand on the doorknob. She had stopped struggling with the something she wanted to remember. Osrith. Osrith confirmed, helpfully. Osrith of Alba. Hild tested. Osrith of Alba, she nodded. Osrith of Bibbenberg.